When the iron will of the Homeowners Association president caged his sprawling ranch and snapped a lock on his freedom, the world watched, expecting him to break. But Landon Croft was about to flip the board with a single, audacious play no one could have predicted. Landon Croft knew the fury of tempests that could splinter wood and snap wire, yet he'd never faced a barrier like this. For this fence wasn't forged from metal or timber. It was constructed from rigid regulations, blinding pride, and a heavy brass padlock that wasn't his to open. It happened on a crisp March morning, the instant the sun cast its first golden rays across the undulating fields outside Stone Creek, as he stepped onto his porch, a warm mug in hand, only to be stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of a stark, shimmering new fence bisecting his land. This was not his fence. It did not even stand on his soil, and piercing its center, his only path in or out, was a formidable steel gate bearing a heavy lock and an imposing sign, Property Access, managed by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. He placed his mug on the weathered porch rail, his eyes fixed in disbelief. His cattle were grazing peacefully within, now transformed into exhibits in a pen, and the familiar access road, the artery that connected him to the county highway, was now on the other side of that impassable gate. The sole key, he would soon learn, belonged to the HOA's president, Serafina Blackwood, a woman defined by her impeccably sharp suits, even sharper stilettos, and a reputation that cut deeper than either. Landon had sought refuge here only 6 weeks prior, escaping the relentless gridlock and clamor of Silverton. At 46, with hands hardened by labor and a spine that still sang with the memory of the last carving season, he had poured his life savings into this expanse. He had dreamed of tranquil sunrises, the grounding cadence of ranch life, and the deep, resonant lowing of cattle carried on the wind. He had certainly never envisioned a homeowners association, much less one that would physically imprison him. By the time his boots hit the ground and carried him to the gate, 2 men clad in HOA-branded polo shirts were methodically tightening the final bolts. "Morning," Landon called out, wrestling to keep his voice steady. "Care to explain what all this is?" One worker remained fixated on his task, while the other mumbled, "Talk to the board." And then he saw her. Serafina Blackwood arrived in a pristine silver SUV, gliding to a halt. She emerged, her sunglasses perched like a crown, a clipboard clutched beneath her arm. "Mr. Croft," she began, foregoing any pretense of a greeting, "you've been duly notified regarding your non-compliance issues." Landon's brow furrowed. "Non-compliance with what?" "Perimeter fencing is required to align with community standards," she declared with a brisk finality. "Yours does not. Until this is rectified, this measure is in place to prevent additional violations." "This measure?" Landon's gesture swept toward his cattle, now gathering restlessly near the new barrier. "That is my access road. My livestock require water from the creek just down there. And that," he pointed emphatically, "is not your land." Serafina's smile was a thin, cold line. "The access easement falls under the HOA's control. Mr. Croft, it's stipulated in the covenant you consented to upon purchasing the property." A knot tightened in Landon's gut as he recalled the mountain of paperwork from the closing, a dense forest of legalese that only a lawyer could navigate. "Are you telling me you can just lock me in?" "Comply," she stated with stark simplicity, already pivoting toward her vehicle. "Contact our office when you are prepared to discuss the approved style of fencing. Have a wonderful day." The gate slammed shut with a resonant clang, the lock clicked home, and she was gone. The 2 men concluded their work and departed, leaving without another word. Landon stood there for a long, silent moment, hands planted on his hips, the morning wind pulling at the fabric of his shirt. He had faced down belligerent bulls, weathered droughts, and battled soaring feed costs, but he had never encountered a will so fiercely determined to prove a point. That evening he sat across his kitchen table from his neighbor, Silas Corbin, a retired long-haul trucker who had called this place home for 2 decades. "They've been pulling stunts like this for a while," Silas remarked, taking a slow sip of coffee. "Serafina has that board twisted around her little finger. If she decides she doesn't like you, She'll turn your life into a living hell." Landon shook his head, a sense of defiance hardening within him. "I didn't move out to the country to be bullied by a committee." "Then you'd better gear up for a war," Silas countered. "She never backs down. And you can be damn sure she won't hand over that key unless you agree to play her game." Landon leaned back, his gaze drifting up to the ceiling. The full scope of the conflict was still unclear, but a stubborn part of him, forged in the unforgiving realities of ranch life, refused to yield. This land was more than just soil and grass. It was his sanctuary, his life's work, and the foundation of his future. The very next morning he drove into town, purchased a sturdy file folder, and began to meticulously gather every letter, every photograph, and every single piece of paper connected to his property. If Seraphina Blackwood craved a fight, he would give her one. He just had no inkling of how intensely personal and how astonishingly public it was all about to become. 2 days later, Landon found himself stepping into the Whispering Pines clubhouse for his inaugural HOA meeting. The air hung heavy with the faint aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the scent of old, tired carpet, and every chair in the compact conference room was occupied. A panel of 6 board members was arrayed behind a long folding table flanked by neat stacks of documents. At the very center, resplendent in a tailored navy blazer and a necklace that looked to be worth more than his first pickup truck, sat Seraphina Blackwood. Her gaze tracked him as he found a seat at the rear of the room. "Mr. Croft," she announced into the microphone, before the meeting had even officially commenced, "you will be addressed on the agenda under compliance matters." The initial 40 minutes dissolved into a monotonous drone of discussions about landscaping, swimming pool hours, and a heated argument over the color of someone's mailbox. Landon remained focused, poring over the packet they had provided, page after page, detailing regulations on exterior paint, driveway dimensions, and even what constituted acceptable lawn decorations. When his name was finally summoned, he strode to the front, the sound of his worn boots echoing in the otherwise silent room. "Let's discuss the fence you've erected," Seraphina initiated. Landon took a slow, deliberate breath. "It's the very same fence I've used for years on my prior property. It's functional, it's safe, and it secures my cattle." "Functional is not the prevailing standard here," she retorted with practiced smoothness. "Community aesthetics are paramount. All perimeter fencing must be uniform, and yours fails to meet the approved specifications." Landon placed his folder on the table and opened it. "This is a working cattle ranch, not a country club. My fencing is designed for livestock, not to present a pretty picture from the road." A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Rules are rules, sir. If we grant an exception for you, we would be obligated to do so for everyone." Landon met the man's gaze directly. "You already grant exceptions. I pass 3 homes on my own street with varied fencing styles. None of them conform to your standards, and none of them have a padlock on their gate." A few murmurs rippled through the audience as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Seraphina's lips compressed into a tight line. "Those particular cases are currently under review," she said dismissively. "In the interim, your property remains out of compliance. The fines will accumulate until the fencing is rectified." Landon leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "And what about the fact that your fence is obstructing access to my water source? You are actively interfering with my capacity to care for my animals. That's not just wrong, it's reckless." "You possess other water sources," she replied coolly. "We have confirmed this with satellite imagery." A short, humorless laugh escaped Landon's lips. "Imagery? You believe you can discern how I manage my ranch from a photograph?" A wave of whispers spread through the room. Silas Corbin, seated in the second row, raised his hand. "Seraphina, the man has been here less than 2 months. Perhaps we could afford him some time to acclimate before we resort to a locked gate and daily fines." Seraphina didn't so much as glance in his direction. "The HOA has an obligation to uphold standards, Mr. Corbin. If Mr. Croft wishes to be a part of this community, he is required to adhere to the same rules as everyone else." Landon gathered his folder. "And if I don't?" Her voice remained placid, but her eyes were like chips of ice. "Then we proceed with the fines and, should it become necessary, legal action." He returned to his seat without uttering another word, a storm of frustration raging within him. After the meeting concluded, several neighbors approached him. Some offered hurried, whispered words of encouragement, their eyes darting nervously toward Serafina. Others deliberately avoided making eye contact at all. It was starkly apparent that her influence here was immense, extending far beyond the official title of president. Out in the parking lot, Silas caught up to him. "She isn't just strict," he said in a hushed tone. "She has connections on the county zoning board and a cousin who's a major player in real estate. People think long and hard before they cross her." Landon glanced back at the clubhouse. Through the plate glass doors, he could see Serafina shaking hands with a tall man in a business suit, both of them smiling as if they had just sealed a victorious deal. "I'm not playing her game," Landon said at last. "If she wants to escalate this into a war, I'll bring a battle she's not prepared for." But he could not yet comprehend the extreme measures Serafina would employ to maintain her dominion, nor the heavy price this fight would ultimately exact from them both. By the following week, Landon's mailbox had begun to resemble a courthouse clerk's office. Each day delivered a new envelope emblazoned with HOA Compliance Office across the front. Inside lay a series of notices, each one escalating in its aggressive tone. The penalties commenced at $50 a day, then swiftly doubled to $100. They asserted that his fence created a visual inconsistency detrimental to community appeal. Landon read the phrase aloud in his empty kitchen, shaking his head in disbelief. "Visual inconsistency? I'm raising beef cattle, not hosting garden parties." Silas was seated at his table, nursing a cup of black coffee. "They know their playbook perfectly. They just keep stacking the pressure until you either capitulate or you start hemorrhaging cash." That evening, Landon resolved to attend the next HOA meeting, not to engage in another futile argument, but to observe. He reasoned that the more he comprehended their methods, the greater his chances of discovering a vulnerability. The clubhouse was crowded once more, but this time a palpable tension crackled in the air. A woman Landon hadn't seen before, Nora Finch, stood at the podium, her voice trembling as she described a tree the HOA had compelled her to remove. Her eyes met Landon's for a fleeting moment before she quickly looked away. When the agenda shifted to new compliance matters, Serafina's gaze flickered toward him, but she did not call his name. Instead, she methodically recited a litany of other supposed violations. An RV parked for too long in a driveway, a shed painted an unapproved shade, someone's porch light deemed excessively bright. Landon watched with keen focus. The delivery was consistently cold, ruthlessly efficient, and underscored by the implicit threat of further action. Later in the parking lot, Nora approached him. "You're Croft, right? The rancher with the fence problem?" "That's me," Landon confirmed. "They will grind you down until you either surrender or sell," she warned, her voice low. "Serafina has been operating this way for years. She isn't concerned with who you are. She is only concerned with winning." Landon studied her face. "Why do people allow her to keep winning?" Nora's reply was barely a whisper. "Because most people just want to avoid trouble. And Serafina is an expert at making trouble feel very, very expensive." The weight of that conversation lingered with him. He began to see that the HOA wasn't merely enforcing a set of rules. It was cultivating a climate where fear was the primary tool for maintaining order. And now, by refusing to bend, he was drawing a defiant line in that very sand. The next day, Landon placed a call to the HOA office. "I am formally requesting mediation," he stated to the woman on the other end. "I want a face-to-face meeting with the board to negotiate a compromise." When the day of the mediation arrived, he entered the room armed with photographs of his livestock, detailed maps of his property, and a complete record of every interaction to date. Serafina sat on the opposite side of the table, casually flipping through a slender binder, her demeanor suggesting she already knew the foregone conclusion. "Mr. Croft," the mediator began, "the HOA is prepared to waive a portion of the accumulated fines if you commit to replacing your fence within 60 days. Landon shook his head. "That isn't a compromise. That's your initial ultimatum with a slight discount," Serafina interjected smoothly. "We are being quite generous, Mr. Croft. Most residents do not receive this level of consideration. Landon leaned forward, his voice firm. Most residents don't have their animals held captive behind a locked gate either. This has moved beyond a dispute about a fence. This is about my ability to make a living, and you are deliberately obstructing it. The mediator shifted in his chair, a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Let's try to focus on the practical solutions. The practical solution, Landon cut in, his patience wearing thin, is for you to restore my access to my own road and stop acting as if you're doing me some grand favor. Serafina's smile never reached her eyes. We will be in touch, she said, rising from her chair to signal the end of the discussion. The meeting adjourned with no resolution. That night, Landon sat on his porch long after darkness had fallen, listening to the faint, mournful calls of his cattle in the distance. The battle line had been etched into the earth, and it was clear neither side was willing to retreat. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly anticipate, was that the conflict was about to transform from a quiet war of paperwork into something far more visible and far more perilous. The true breaking point arrived on a blustery Thursday morning. Landon had been awake since before dawn, mending a trough pump out by the north pasture. As he made his way toward the creek, he saw his cattle bunched together near the new perimeter fence, their agitation a palpable thing, their movements restless and pacing. He followed their collective gaze, and the problem became instantly, horrifyingly clear. The creek was now entirely sealed off. The new fence didn't just obstruct the road. It severed access to the only dependable water source on that entire side of his property. He let his gloves fall to the earth and hauled himself over the fence, his boots landing with a solid thud on the packed dirt of the other side. Before him, the locked gate stood as a silent, gleaming challenge, the thick steel of its shackle catching the morning sun. He shook it violently, the metallic rattle echoing across the quiet pasture, but there was no response, no one to hear. By mid-morning, he was back on the phone with the HOA office. I require immediate access to that creek, he informed the receptionist, his voice tight with urgency. My cattle cannot be denied water. This is a matter of basic animal welfare. Her reply was clipped and detached. Mr. Croft, the HOA has verified the existence of other water points on your property. Those are backup tanks, he retorted sharply. If a heat wave hits, they won't last a week. Do you want the responsibility for dead livestock on your hands? I can pass your concerns along to the board, she answered, her disinterest painfully obvious, but I have no authority to grant you access. That afternoon, Landon drove directly to Serafina Blackwood's residence. Her home was a picture of perfection. Siding freshly painted, hedges meticulously sculpted, not a single leaf out of place. She answered the door in a pale blue blouse, her expression a careful mask of politeness. This is no longer about fines, Landon stated, fighting to keep his voice level. This is about my animals. You are cutting them off from their water. Serafina's response was so smooth it felt rehearsed. Mr. Croft, the HOA must operate under a uniform standard. If we begin making exceptions, we compromise the integrity of the entire community. The integrity of the community? His voice began to rise despite his efforts. You're fixated on a fence, while I'm talking about living, breathing creatures that depend on me to survive. Her expression remained an unreadable, placid lake. The rules are the rules. Landon took a step back, his hands balling into fists at his sides to stop himself from saying something he would later regret. This is not over, Serafina. As he turned to leave, he saw a flicker of movement behind her curtains. Neighbors peering out, watching the drama unfold. The conflict was no longer a private affair between him and the HOA president. It had become a public spectacle. 2 days later, the first signs of distress began to show in his herd. A number of cattle stood listlessly by the fence, their lowing calls directed toward the inaccessible creek. Landon began hauling in supplementary water tanks, but the relentless cycle of filling and transporting them was both physically draining and financially costly. Silas came by to help one afternoon, leaning against the truck as they wrestled another heavy tank into place. She's playing a dangerous game, Silas said, his brow furrowed with concern. She's trying to break you, to wear you down until you have no choice but to give in. "She's not going to get what she wants," Landon replied, grabbing a wrench from his toolbox. "I'll haul water from now until winter if I have to, but I am not tearing down a perfectly good fence just to satisfy her cosmetic ideals." Yet the strain was undeniably mounting. By the end of the week, Landon was operating on fumes, his days a blur of ranch duties punctuated by the constant arrival of more letters and notices from the HOA. One envelope contained a photograph, clearly taken from the road, showing one of his water tanks tilted at a slight angle. The accompanying letter declared it a safety hazard and demanded its immediate removal. "This is just harassment," Silas said after reading it, his voice filled with disgust. "That," Landon replied grimly, "is Serafina." And then one morning the entire landscape of the conflict shifted. A "for sale" sign had materialized on the small half-acre plot of land that housed the locked gate. This piece of land was technically a separate entity, belonging neither to his ranch nor to the main HOA holdings. Landon stood there staring at the sign, the gears in his mind spinning with sudden, furious speed. If he could acquire that strip of land, he would own the gate. And if he owned the gate, the lock would finally be his to command. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that if Serafina caught even a whisper of his plan, she would move heaven and earth to stop him. Whatever he did next had to be swift, and it had to be silent. Landon didn't make a mad dash for the real estate office. He understood that charging forward without a clear map of the terrain was a fool's errand. That afternoon he drove into Stone Creek and sat down with Elias Gable, a seasoned local attorney whose office carried the comforting scent of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. Elias had the kind of firm handshake that spoke of decades spent navigating complex disputes. Landon laid out the collection of letters, photographs, and the latest barrage of HOA notices across the lawyer's desk. "I need to know if what they're doing is even legal," he began. "And if I manage to buy the land that gate sits on, does that give me absolute control?" Elias adjusted his spectacles, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. "They're operating within the strict confines of the covenants you agreed to when you bought the property," he said slowly, the words landing with a heavy thud. "That's the bad news. Those regulations were woven into the purchase agreement, and they grant the HOA a level of control that most people never fully comprehend." "And the good news?" Landon pressed. Elias tapped a finger on the photo of the "for sale" sign. "If that parcel is genuinely separate from HOA ownership, and it contains the sole access point to your property, then yes, you would possess every legal right to control it. But you must verify that beyond a shadow of a doubt before you make a move. And," he added, his voice lowering, "you need to orchestrate the purchase in a way that doesn't set off any alarm bells at the HOA office." Landon nodded, understanding immediately. "Meaning Serafina can't find out it's me?" "Precisely," Elias confirmed. "If she gets wind of it, she could pressure the seller to entertain a rival offer, or find some bureaucratic loophole to rezone the land before the sale can close. Your name must be completely invisible in this transaction." For the next several days, Landon maintained his routine with meticulous precision, a mask of normalcy. He tended to the cattle, he hauled water, he offered casual waves to his neighbors. But by night, his kitchen table transformed into a command center where he meticulously drafted his strategy. He reached out to an old friend from his college days, Finian Rowe, who operated a property management firm 2 counties away. Finian readily agreed to establish a limited liability company, an LLC, under his corporate umbrella, effectively creating a shield of anonymity for Landon in the impending transaction. One evening, Silas stopped by and discovered Landon hunched over a county plat map. "You're brewing up something big," Silas observed with a knowing grin. Landon didn't bother with a denial. "If I tell you, I'll need you to swear this conversation never happened." Silas raised a hand in a solemn vow. "My lips are sealed." Landon then laid out the entire plan in quiet, deliberate tones. By the time he concluded, Silas's grin had stretched even wider. "That's audacious," he said, "and I absolutely love it." Meanwhile, Serafina seemed to possess an uncanny intuition that the dynamics were shifting. She began to appear near the fence with increasing frequency, sometimes accompanied by 2 other board members. They would stand by the gate, engaged in hushed conversations, their gazes frequently drifting in Landon's direction. One afternoon, as he was mending a post near the main pasture, she approached, her ever-present clipboard in hand. "Mr. Croft," she announced, "we have scheduled another compliance inspection for next week." Landon didn't even look up from his work. "You can schedule whatever you like. My fence is not changing." "You are only making this more difficult for yourself," she replied coolly. He finally straightened up and met her gaze, his own eyes as hard as stone. "And you are severely underestimating me." They locked eyes for a tense moment before she spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV. The following morning, Landon's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Finian. The seller had accepted the LLC's initial offer without a counter, without a single question. The closing was scheduled for just under 3 weeks away. It felt like the first tangible victory in a long and grueling campaign. But Elias Gable urged caution. "The deal isn't done until the ink is dry," he warned. "Don't let your opponent know you're already holding the winning cards." Landon agreed. He understood that Serafina would not relent until she was certain of her victory. The strategy, then, was to let her believe she was still in command, right up to the very moment her power evaporated. But keeping a secret in a small, interconnected community is like trying to cup water in your hands, and Landon was about to discover just how quickly the truth could spill. 2 days after Finian's call, Landon drove past the contested lot. A quiet reconnaissance mission to confirm the "for sale" sign was still there. A lone sentinel planted in the ground. It was. A gust of wind had curled one of its corners, but otherwise, everything remained unchanged. He parked his truck further down the road and simply sat for a while, observing. The property itself was insignificant, just large enough to accommodate the gate, a slender gravel strip, and a thin veil of mesquite trees at its rear. Yet it was the choke point, the single artery for everything that lay beyond. Whoever held this tiny sliver of land controlled every vehicle, every delivery, and every person that set foot on his ranch. Landon knew the HOA would have already seized it if they'd had the necessary funds or a legitimate legal claim. The fact that they hadn't meant a vulnerability existed, a narrow gap he was now poised to slip through unnoticed. That afternoon, Finian called again. "Title search is crystal clear. No lines, no disputes. The seller just wants to unload it fast, probably has no idea what kind of leverage it holds." A rare smile touched Landon's lips. "Good. Let's make sure it stays that way." The next week was a masterclass in quiet discipline. He maintained his careful routine. No unscheduled trips to town, no revealing conversations with neighbors. When anyone inquired about the fence situation, he offered a non-committal shrug and a simple, "We'll see how it shakes out." Inside, however, his mind was already replaying the satisfying turn of his own key in that heavy padlock. One evening, Silas arrived with a small cooler of beer and leaned against the porch railing. "You've been awfully quiet these days," he remarked. "That's either a very good sign, or you're about to do something reckless." Landon passed him a cold bottle. "Let's just say I'm getting my pieces in place so I never have to ask for permission again." Silas grinned. "Now that's the Landon I know." The most difficult part was suppressing the urge to reveal his hand. He encountered Serafina twice that week as she drove past his property. She offered her usual curt wave, more a twitch of the fingers than a genuine greeting, and he kept his expression a perfect, unreadable mask. But within the walls of the HOA office, whispers were turning into plans. Nora Finch, the neighbor who had warned him about Serafina's tactics, found him in the grocery store one morning. "I heard the board has been making inquiries about that gate lot," she said in a hushed voice, glancing around the deserted aisle. "I don't know what their plan is, but they're talking to a surveyor." Landon kept his voice even. "I appreciate the heads up." That night he was on the phone with Finian. "We need to accelerate this. If they start bringing in surveyors, they could stall the sale or try to entangle it in legal challenges." Finian didn't miss a beat. "I'll light a fire under the title company. We can have you in escrow by Friday." The intervening days felt like a pot on a slow simmer. Landon went through the motions of his chores, but every crunch of tires on the gravel road made him glance up, his nerves on edge. The image of Serafina sweeping in at the 11th hour to sabotage the deal was a persistent, gnawing thought. On Friday morning, Finian called again, his voice triumphant. "It's a done deal. Escrow is open. The deposit is in. We are locked in. The only way this falls through is if you back out, and I know you're not backing out." Landon exhaled a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Let's close this as fast as humanly possible." He didn't celebrate that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, methodically listing every conceivable scenario. Once he controlled the gate, he had no doubt Serafina's counterattack would be swift and aggressive. She might summon the sheriff, threaten him with lawsuits, or even rally the board to invent new regulations. But none of that would matter if the legal ownership was indisputably his. Still, the victory would feel hollow if the HOA simply found another way to box him in. He had to be prepared not just for the immediate fight, but for the long, drawn-out fallout. Yet even with all his careful planning, Landon could not foresee the speed at which the tension would escalate once the sale became public, nor how decisively the lines within the community would be redrawn. The closing was scheduled for a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the sky felt oppressively heavy but stubbornly refused to rain. Landon dressed as he would on any other day. Worn jeans, boots still carrying the dust of the pasture, and a simple button-up shirt. He drove into Stone Creek without a word to anyone, parking discreetly behind the title company's small brick building. Finian was already there, nursing a cup of coffee and reviewing the paperwork. "Morning," Finian said with a wide grin. "Ready to make Serafina Blackwood's life significantly more complicated?" Landon smirked. "Let's make it happen." The procedure was remarkably simple. Because the LLC was the official buyer, Landon's name never appeared on any of the sale documents. Finian signed on behalf of the company, slid the stack of papers across the polished desk, and within an hour, the transaction was complete. The keys, a single, heavy silver set on a worn leather fob, lay in the center of the table. Finian pushed them toward Landon. "They're all yours." Landon picked them up, the largest key cool and solid in his hand. He could feel its weight, not just the heft of metal, but the undeniable weight of leverage. For months, Serafina had held the power, dictating when and how he could access his own land. Now, with a single turn of this key, all of that power was about to shift. They exited through the back door, careful to avoid any unwanted attention. Finian clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations! You just bought yourself a gate and a whole new fight." Back at the ranch, Landon parked by the road and walked the final 50 yards to the lot. The gate stood there unchanged. Yet it looked entirely different to him now. It was no longer a barrier. It was his. He slid the new key into the padlock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click, and the shackles sprang open. The sound was sharper than he'd anticipated, a sound of finality, like a door closing on an old chapter. He swung the gate wide, stepping back to let the cattle in the nearest pasture begin their slow, ambling journey toward the creek. For the first time in weeks, he felt a profound sense of control settling back into his bones. That feeling lasted for exactly 2 days. On the third morning, a pristine white SUV pulled up and stopped directly in front of the open gate. Serafina emerged, her heels clicking on the gravel, clipboard at the ready. 2 other board members followed her out of the vehicle. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice an icy calm, "it appears you have accessed HOA property without authorization." Landon leaned casually against the gate he now owned. "This isn't HOA property any longer. I own this lot. Feel free to check the county records if you doubt my word." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "That's impossible. The association had the first right of refusal." "Perhaps you did," he said evenly, "but you didn't exercise it. The seller accepted my offer. Now, this gate belongs to me, and I have the deed to prove it." One of the board members shifted his weight, a look of unease on his face. "Serafina, if that's true—" She cut him off with a sharp glance. "We will see about that." Turning her attention back to Landon, she added, "Don't for a moment think this is concluded. We will challenge this." Landon didn't even flinch. "Challenge whatever you wish. In the meantime, you no longer control this access point." "I do." They departed without another word, but the air was thick with unspoken threats. By that afternoon, Landon had received 3 separate emails from the HOA, each demanding immediate clarification of the gate's ownership status. He forwarded them all to Elias Gable, whose reply was concise: "Let them make the next move." Over the next week, the news spread like wildfire. Neighbors he barely knew would stop him at the feed store or wave him down on the road. Some offered quiet congratulations, their words hushed as if afraid of being overheard. Others warned him that the board was actively seeking ways to make an example of him. Silas stopped by one evening to find Landon on his porch, boots propped up on the railing. "Looks like you kicked the hornet's nest," Silas observed. Landon took a sip of his coffee. "Good. Maybe it's about time this place stopped being so afraid of Serafina." But what Landon didn't yet grasp was that seizing control of the gate was merely the opening salvo. The real war was about to turn ugly, and it was poised to drag the entire neighborhood right into the crossfire. It didn't take long for the HOA to mount its counteroffensive. 2 days after Serafina's visit, Landon received a certified letter. It claimed his ownership of the lot may constitute an encroachment on association rights, and demanded he cease any alteration to the property pending a full legal review. He walked the letter over to Silas's house that evening. Silas read it, then let out a loud laugh. "They're bluffing! If they had a legitimate claim, they'd have filed a lawsuit already." Landon shrugged. "Bluff or not, they're not giving up." The tension escalated to a new peak that Saturday. Landon was hauling a fresh load of feed onto the ranch when he saw Serafina standing at the gate, this time flanked by 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies. The blue and gold decals on their patrol cars gleamed in the harsh sunlight. As Landon slowed his truck and rolled down the window, one of the deputies approached. "Mr. Croft, we received a call concerning a property dispute. We're just here to maintain the peace." Landon climbed out of his truck, his ownership paperwork already in hand. "Deputies, this is my land. This lot, this gate, it's all on the deed. I purchased it fair and square." Serafina crossed her arms, her expression stern. "That property has historically been under HOA management. He is interfering with community access." Landon handed a copy of the recorded deed to one of the deputies. The officer examined it, nodding slowly. "It checks out. He owns it." Serafina's jaw tightened. "We will be taking this to court." "That is your right, ma'am," the deputy replied calmly. "But as of right now, there is no law being broken here." They left shortly after, but the confrontation had drawn a small audience of neighbors. Landon could overhear fragments of their conversations, some voices offering support, others clearly siding with Serafina. The division in the community was becoming a stark, undeniable reality. That night, his phone lit up with a text from Nora Finch. "Be careful. They're convening an emergency board meeting on Monday. Rumor is they're trying to push through new rules designed to hit you hard." Monday arrived, and Landon made sure to show up to the meeting early. The room was packed, the air so thick with tension you could almost taste it. Serafina wasted no time. "As many of you are aware," she began, "recent events have exposed certain gaps in our ability to maintain community standards. The board is therefore proposing an amendment that would grant the HOA authority over any and all access points that serve more than one property." Landon raised his hand. "That's a rather convenient amendment, isn't it? Considering it seems to be targeting one specific owner, me." "This is not about you, Mr. Croft," she replied, though her eyes remained locked on his. "This is about the community as a whole." The ensuing debate was sharp and contentious. Landon argued that the proposed amendment would grant the HOA unprecedented power over land it did not own. Serafina countered with vague assertions about security and consistency. When the vote was called, the board was split. 3 in favor, 2 against. But for the amendment to pass, it still required a majority vote from the homeowners themselves. After the meeting, several neighbors pulled Landon aside. One of them, a wiry man named Mateo Reyes, spoke in a low, urgent voice. "You're not the first person she's tried to steamroll, but you just might be the first one who can actually beat her. Keep fighting." By midweek, the battle had spilled over onto social media. A local community Facebook page erupted with posts about the gate, the HOA, and the question of whether Serafina had finally gone too far. Landon kept his own contributions measured, sticking to the facts and sharing public records. But the comment sections revealed the true story. Neighbors were choosing sides as if it were a heated small-town election. Then came the most unexpected twist of all. Silas appeared one evening holding a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside was an anonymous typewritten note. "Check the county clerk's filings tomorrow." Landon did exactly that. And what he discovered made his stomach clench. Serafina had filed a notice of intent to purchase an adjacent strip of land, one that ran parallel to his fence line. If she acquired it, she could construct an alternate access route, effectively neutralizing his hard-won leverage. But if she thought that move would intimidate him, she was about to learn that Landon Croft had no intention of surrendering a single inch, not after coming this far. The day after learning of Serafina's filing, Landon went straight to Elias Gable's office. The lawyer was leaning back in his chair, the morning sun slanting across a desk piled high with case files. "She's trying to box me in again," Landon said, placing the printed notice on the desk. "If she gets that strip of land, she can bypass my gate entirely." Elias read the document, then nodded slowly. "It's a shrewd move, I'll give her that. But it's far from a done deal. That land is currently county-owned and has been earmarked for potential utility access. She'll have to navigate a labyrinth of bureaucratic hurdles to acquire it. We can slow her down. We'll file an objection, request a formal review of the sale process, maybe even lobby the county to keep it as public land." "Do it," Landon said without hesitation. "I'll cover whatever it costs." Elias immediately set to work, but beyond the legal maneuvering, the situation was rapidly escalating in the court of public opinion. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. "Rancher battles HOA over locked gate." The article itself was relatively balanced, but the accompanying photograph, Landon leaning against his gate, arms crossed, painted a powerful image of a man making a stand. The next morning at the feed store, people he hardly knew approached him to shake his hand. "Saw you in the paper," one older man said with a nod of approval. "It's about time someone stood up to them." Not everyone was on his side. At the grocery store, a woman wearing an HOA volunteer badge muttered, "You're making things difficult for all of us," as she brushed past him in the aisle. Landon didn't dignify it with a response. By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by a local talk radio show. For nearly an hour, callers debated the situation, some passionately arguing for property rights, others defending the HOA's need for order. Landon listened from the cab of his truck, amazed at how quickly his personal struggle had transformed into a public referendum. Then came the annual community barbecue at the town park, an event usually dedicated to relaxed neighborly gossip over smoked brisket and sweet tea. This year it felt more like a political convention. Small groups huddled under the shade trees, some openly sporting "Croft is right" pins that Silas had apparently distributed. Landon tried to keep to the perimeter, a plate of food in his hand, but he knew an encounter with Serafina was inevitable. She approached him, flanked by two board members, her smile stretched thin. "Mr. Croft," she said, "enjoying the festivities?" "Not as much as I'd enjoy getting my time back instead of dealing with all this," he replied evenly. Her smile didn't waver. "You've made your position clear, but the HOA will continue to enforce its rules. You would be wise to consider the long-term consequences of this kind of publicity." Landon looked her directly in the eye. "You've used fear to maintain control for years. That ends now." The exchange captured the attention of those nearby. Conversations quieted as people turned to watch. Serafina, sensing the shift, altered her tone, adopting a facade of conciliation. "We can still resolve this without dragging it through the courts." "You had your chance to do that months ago," Landon said, his voice firm. "You chose the padlock instead." She turned and walked away, the sharp click of her heels on the concrete path punctuating her retreat. Later that night, Nora called him. "You know she's absolutely furious, right? She's lost control of the narrative. People are no longer afraid to question her." Landon leaned back in his chair. "Good. Maybe that's the real victory here." Still, he knew it was far from over. Serafina was too deeply invested to walk away without one last, drastic move. Sure enough, 2 days later, Elias called with the news. Serafina had filed a lawsuit, officially challenging his ownership of the gate lot and alleging procedural irregularities in the sale. But instead of feeling a wave of intimidation, Landon felt something else entirely. A deep, unwavering resolve, stronger than it had been at any point in this long fight. Now he wasn't just defending his land. He was defending every neighbor who had ever been silenced by the HOA and had never fought back. The summons arrived on a Friday afternoon, a thick packet hand-delivered by a deputy who offered Landon a sympathetic glance. "Guess you knew this was coming," the deputy said. Landon simply nodded. "Yeah, I was expecting it." Inside, the language was a dense thicket of legal arguments about easements, covenants, and undue influence on the sale process. But beneath the layers of jargon, Landon recognized it for what it was: a final, desperate gambit to reclaim control. Elias met with him the next morning. "They have nothing solid," the lawyer stated, flipping through the pages. "The sale was clean, the title is clear. They're gambling that you'll grow weary of the fight and agree to settle." Landon shook his head. "I'm not settling." Over the subsequent weeks, the case progressed through the county court system. Each hearing attracted a mix of curious townspeople, supportive neighbors, and a small contingent of HOA loyalists who sat stiffly in the back, arms crossed. Landon noted that Serafina always arrived early, impeccably dressed, and flanked by her board allies. She never once acknowledged his presence. During one recess in the proceedings, Nora approached him in the hallway. "Win or lose," she said, "you've already changed things here. People are speaking up more. They're questioning the rules instead of just silently writing the checks." Landon appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't interested in a moral victory. He wanted a real one. That victory arrived on a brilliant Tuesday morning in early summer. The judge ruled that the purchase was valid, the title was sound, and the HOA held no legal authority over the lot or the gate. Landon would keep his property, and, in a final, stunning turn, the HOA was ordered to cover all of his legal fees. When the gavel fell, a low murmur of approval swept through the courtroom. Silas grinned from the second row, offering Landon a subtle thumbs up. Nora was beaming. Even a few neighbors who had remained silent throughout the ordeal came over to shake his hand. Outside on the courthouse steps, a small group of reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Landon kept his statement brief. "This was never just about a fence," he said. "It was about the principle that you don't let someone take what is yours simply because they believe they have the power to do so. I hope this gives others the courage to stand their ground." Back at the ranch, he drove out to the gate. The cattle were grazing contentedly near the creek, the water shimmering in the sunlight. He leaned against a post, feeling the warm breeze on his face. For the first time in months, the heavy weight was gone from his shoulders. There was no locked gate standing between him and his land. Silas joined him a few minutes later, holding 2 bottles of cold beer. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he said. Landon smiled. "It's more than that. It's the knowledge that when you stand up just once, you might give other people the courage to do the same." They sat there in the shade, talking about the herd, the weather, and what might lie ahead. Landon knew the HOA wouldn't simply disappear, and Serafina would likely still find small, petty ways to make things difficult. But she had learned a crucial lesson about the limits of intimidation, and he had learned that persistence, when fortified by the truth, could ultimately win. Weeks later, Landon observed something small but profoundly significant. The entire tone of the HOA meetings had shifted. Board members chose their words more carefully. Neighbors began to raise questions without glancing over their shoulders. The pervasive fear that had held the community in its grip for years had finally begun to crack. And that, Landon thought, was the real victory. If there was a single lesson to be drawn from it all, it was this: the moment you refuse to let someone else write the rules for your life is the moment you truly begin to live on your own terms. So if you are listening to this, and you are facing your own locked gate, whatever form it may take, do not assume you have to accept it. Ask questions, push back, and if the fight is worth fighting, do not stop until you have turned that lock with your very own key. Subscribe for more real stories that remind you that your voice matters, your rights matter, and no one can fence in your life unless you allow them to.